Hey everyone, glad you're here. Today we're talking about something that's quietly turning into one of the most important government decisions in years. Trump's big, beautiful bill, and what's in it could seriously affect your taxes, your health care, and especially, if you're a senior, your benefits. And guess what? Right now, in the middle of the Senate, they're working through a special kind of voting session that's long, chaotic, and a little bit historic. It's called a Vote-a-rama, and it's happening as we speak. But what most people don't realize is that behind all the headlines about border walls and tax breaks for businesses, this bill makes major changes to programs like Medicaid, and that could hit seniors hardest. There's one line buried in the legislation that could mean 11 million people lose coverage over the next decade. And yeah, that includes a big chunk of older Americans. Before we get started, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's one thing you're most concerned about when it comes to your future, your health, your retirement, your taxes? Let's talk about it. And if you find this helpful, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss these kinds of breakdowns. So let's start with what's going on right now. We're in the middle of something called a Vote-a-rama. Sounds silly, but it's actually serious stuff. Basically, the Senate is allowed to vote on as many amendments as they want, all back-to-back, before they get to the final version of a big budget bill. That means they're up all night, casting vote after vote, most of which don't even pass. But they're important because each one reveals who stands where and what parts of the bill people are willing to fight for. As of the latest update, they've only gotten through 14 votes over 7 hours. That's slow. And with dozens more to go, the final decision might not come until the early morning of July 1st. So yeah, it's a mess and it's designed to test endurance just as much as policy. Now, the bill itself is massive, 940 pages long. Some are calling it one big, beautiful bill, and it's basically a combination of tax reforms, immigration enforcement, and massive spending cuts. President Trump is calling it the centerpiece of his second term. This isn't just some symbolic thing. It's a real legislative push to reshape the way money flows in and out of the government. One of the big promises in this bill is permanent tax relief. That includes eliminating taxes on tips and overtime pay, which could really help folks working hourly jobs, especially in service industries. That sounds pretty good on the surface. More money in your pocket, right? But here's where it gets complicated. To pay for those tax cuts and the increased spending on border security and defense, about $150 billion, by the way, the bill proposes over $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid. That's huge, and that's where seniors, in particular, are starting to feel the heat. You see, Medicaid isn't just for low-income families. A lot of older adults rely on it to cover long-term care, nursing homes, home aides, things Medicare doesn't fully handle. So when you start pulling money out of Medicaid, even if your own income looks stable, the services you or your loved ones depend on could disappear. That's not an exaggeration. The Congressional Budget Office, which runs the numbers on all this, says that nearly 12 million people could lose coverage under the Senate's version of the bill. And if you factor in rising costs and state-level impacts, that number could reach 17 million. So what does that mean for you? If you're a senior or someone who's planning for retirement, this could affect your access to care, especially if you're in a state that leans heavily on Medicaid to fund elder care programs. Places like Texas, Florida, South Carolina, those states could see major service reductions. And also, it's worth mentioning that not every Republican is on board with this. Senator Thom Tillis from North Carolina gave a pretty emotional speech saying that this bill would betray over 600,000 people in his state. He called out the Medicaid cuts directly. Then he said he's not running for re-election. That's a big move. Trump, of course, fired back on Truth Social with a post that basically celebrated Tillis stepping away. Politics aside, that tells you how tense things have gotten. And now here's something a little unexpected. Not all the criticism is coming from Democrats. Elon Musk, who's usually pretty aligned with conservative ideas, came out and blasted the bill. He said the spending is insane and joked that we're all living in a one-party system called the Porky Pig Party. That's not your everyday political commentary. And on top of that, there was a protest outside the Capitol with more than 250 demonstrators laying symbolic caskets on the Supreme Court steps. These weren't random props. They had statistics printed on them, numbers of people expected to lose coverage in each state. It was part of a movement called Moral Mondays, and it made the front page of more than a few local newspapers. So yeah, emotions are high. And here's another thing. This bill doesn't just touch healthcare. It also impacts taxes in ways that could surprise you. For example, if you're someone who relies on the state and local tax deduction, also called SALT, there's a change there. The bill extends that deduction, but only for 5 years. That's shorter than many expected. And then there's the federal debt ceiling. The bill raises it by $5 trillion. Not billion, trillion. That would push the national debt to nearly $42 trillion. That alone has some senators like Rand Paul calling it totally irresponsible. He said it's going to bury our children under mountains of debt. Whether or not that's hyperbole, it's clear this bill is changing the debt conversation. And speaking of money math, Republicans are also using something called a current policy baseline. Basically, they're pretending that certain tax cuts from 2017 are already permanent, even though they're not. This makes the new bill seem cheaper than it actually is. Democrats are calling that fake math, but Republicans voted to adopt it anyway. It's a budget trick that lowers the projected cost by nearly $4 trillion, on paper at least. So where does that leave us? Well, the Vote-a-rama is still ongoing, and even though the Senate has a Republican majority, the cracks are showing. Senators like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are asking for changes. Murkowski managed to negotiate some Alaska-specific items into the bill, like a tax break for whaling captains. Yes, that's a real thing, and some nutrition support carve-outs. That's what happens in big bills. People trade votes for local goodies. But once this thing clears the Senate, it heads back to the House. And that's not a done deal either. The House already passed their version back in May, but it was narrower, and some of the more extreme spending cuts weren't in it. Now that the Senate has made changes, there's tension. Members of the House Freedom Caucus are furious. They're saying they didn't even have time to review the bill before being told to vote on it. They're threatening to block it unless they get more say. And this is all supposed to wrap up before the 4th of July. And why? Because Trump wants the bill signed before Independence Day. He's using that as a symbolic deadline. But symbolism doesn't get you 218 House votes. So the clock's ticking and the pressure is on. Now, if you're wondering, what happens if this bill passes? Well, a lot. Tax rules change, healthcare coverage shifts, and entitlement programs get restructured. But the real story might be how people react afterward. If millions really do lose coverage, or if Medicaid funding dries up in certain states, we could see protests, lawsuits, and local governments scrambling to fill the gaps. But if you're in a low-tax state, or you work in a tip job, or you're a business owner, you might see some real short-term financial gains. That's the trade-off, and that's what makes this so complicated. So what should you take away from all this? First, don't tune it out. I know politics can feel overwhelming, but these bills directly affect your life, your pocketbook, and your future, especially if you're retired or getting close to it. Second, stay informed. Even though the name Vote-a-rama sounds like a game show, what's happening is anything but funny. The decisions being made over the next couple of days could shape retirement security for millions of Americans. And finally, keep asking questions. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What's one thing in this bill that concerns you? Or maybe even something you support? I'll be reading through and responding. If this was helpful and you want more clear, no-drama breakdowns like this, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We keep things calm, clear, and honest here. And I think that's what we all need a little more of these days. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.